Many times we read the Bible as if it's just a storybook. While it does contain stories about God's relationship with His people, there are many principles from which we can glean for everyday life. Take, for example, the story of the widow woman and Elisha the prophet, who, after her husband died, she had nothing to live on, and the creditors were coming to collect for his debt. She, out of desperation, went to Elisha for help. Let's take a look at how the situation unfolds. 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 1 to 7, and it reads, Now a woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, saying, Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared the Lord, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves. So Elisha said to her, What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? And she said, Your servant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. Then he said, Go borrow containers elsewhere for yourself, empty containers from all your neighbors. Do not get too few. Then you shall come in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour into all these containers, and you shall set aside what is full. So she left him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They began bringing the containers to her, and she poured the oil. When the containers were full, she said to her sons, Bring me another container. But he said to her, There are no more containers. Then the oil stopped. So she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest. So here we see the situation. She has no money, no way of paying her debt. The only thing she had in her house was a jar of oil. The prophet sent her to collect containers, empty containers from her neighbors, and he said, don't just get a few, make sure you get a whole lot of containers, and go in and shut the door and pour the oil from the jar you had, and once you start pouring, then you will have more oil to fill up all the jars. Now it doesn't say how many containers that she collected, but it tells us that once the jars were all filled, the oil from her jar stopped flowing. So what are the 5 principles that we can learn or glean from this story, this encounter with Elijah the prophet and the widow woman in her situation for our lives today? So first thing we can see is that we can learn to seek godly counsel in every situation in our lives. Let us look to seek godly counsel, whether it's from our pastors or our leaders, or even us going to God ourselves. The Bible tells us that those who lack wisdom, let them ask of God, and He will give to us, without reproach. And He is willingly, whenever we call to God, He will answer. So let us always seek godly counsel. Sometimes we have the tendency of just going to our friends for advice, but we have to learn that in every situation we have to seek godly counsel. And number 2, follow instructions. We have to learn to follow the instructions no matter if it doesn't line up to our expectations. See, the widow woman, she could have went to any one of the prophets among the prophets, because the sons of the prophets, but she chose to go to Elisha, and he gave her specific instructions. He said, go collect containers from your neighbors and pour the oil in those containers. Now she could have said to Elisha, how is it that this one jar of oil that I have supposed to fill all these containers? See, she wasn't concerned about whether or not the oil will fill all these containers. She was obedient to follow instructions. So we must learn to follow instructions no matter if our mind cannot understand, or it is not what we perceive that we should receive. And number 3, we have to connect with the right people. See, she went to her neighbors. He told her, go to your neighbors. So when you are around people who will actually help you to carry out the instruction or the vision that God has given you, then you are able to move in the right direction and to be able to fulfill what God has called you to fulfill. Our pastor always tells us, that we should always be in the right place at the right time with the right people doing the right thing. So make sure that in your life you are aligning yourself with the right people. And number 4, fulfill your commitment. See, her commitment was to be able to have what she need to pay her debts, to pay off the creditors, so they will not take her son to take them as slaves. So when she did what she did, it says that he told her, make sure you pay your debt and pay your debt. So whenever God has answered our prayers, whenever God has delivered us from a certain situation, whether it be financial or spiritual, or whether it is physical healing, whatever it is, make sure that if we make a vow to the Lord, or if we promise to do something, that we are committed to fulfill our commitment. Make sure that you fulfill what you have believing God for. If you're saying, God, I am believing you for a financial miracle so that I can pay my debt, make sure when God gives you that miracle, you pay your debt, and don't forget about, this is the reason why you have this miraculous breakthrough. Don't take the blessing that God has given you and spend it on your own needs and spend it on your wants, and your personal desire, and neglecting to pay your debt. So always remember to fulfill your commitment. And number 5, live from the overflow. And that's why he told her, when all the jar has been filled, sell the jars and then pay your debt and live from the overflow. So remember, God doesn't just supply your needs. He gives you everything pertaining to life and godliness, according to what we learn in 1 Peter. So remember, live from the overflow. That means when God is blessing you, he's giving you more than enough. Like Paul tells us, my God shall supply all your needs according to his riches in glory. And he also tells us that, God can do exceedingly abundantly above all that we think, ask, or imagine, because God will give unto us as we give, pressed down, shaken together, good measure, so that we are and running over. So God always gives us more than we need. God is not a stingy God, but we have to remember this also. Another key principle in this text, it says that her husband was a man who honored and feared God. And it's obvious that from her approach to Elisha the prophet, she was also a woman who feared God. She honored God. She reverenced God. So we also need to have a fear or a reverence of God, to serve God and to worship him. And that is why she was able to go to the prophet, to ask for help, because she understood spiritual authority. She understood that just as how her husband was a servant to the prophet Elisha and a servant to the Lord, and that God took care of the prophets, she knew that the blessing that was bestowed on the prophets would come upon her as a widow, because God's heart is always towards the widow, the orphan, the strangers. So remember this: in all things reverence the Lord and serve him, and the Lord will take care of your every need and give you more than enough, so you can live from the overflow. I hope that you find this teaching helpful today, and I would love to hear from you. Which one of these principles do you find it hard to connect with in your everyday life? Or which one of these principles can you relate to the most? I would love to hear your thoughts. Leave your comments below. Also, if you would like to get more teaching on the scriptures and how to apply them to your everyday life, subscribe to my channel and make sure you hit the notification bell so that you will always know when I upload more teachings. Until next time, shalom, shalom.